Welcome back. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to be able now to say to the player, okay, if your starting weapon's a hoe, it instantiates a hoe in an adjustable and correct grip. So the grip will be specified here as a transform. And if you decided instead that this player was to start not with a hoe, but with a rod, then the rod would be instantiated in a different grip that is specific to the rod. So we would see that, for example, in rod scriptable object, you've now got a grip transform. So that allows us to customize the grip of every single weapon regardless of how it's rotated or where its pivot point is as a asset that you may have got, that you may have made or got from the asset store. We can deal with any rotation or translation of that asset. So I'll see you soon. Now, at this stage, we have some things I'd like to sort out. We've got a whole bunch of warnings. I don't like leaving warnings, but I'm halfway through something right now. We have got weapons spawning, but we have not got weapons being childed to the hand. So I'm going to sort that out. Then I will sort all these issues out. Now, look, I'm also very aware of something else, which is that we have an issue with our prefab. The player prefab, if we look at what I've done in this change here, video 47, I did not operate on the player. You can see that from this top level roll up in my version control. But in this video, I did operate on the player and it's prefab. In fact, I removed the sword, the hoe from the prefab's hand. So I've changed the player prefab. But remember also that Rick has changed the player prefab over in his scene. In fact, he did a fair amount of work on the player over in his scene. He's changed the prefab instance, but I don't think he applied it back to the prefab. Because if we go, look, here is my prefab. If I go grab the player and drop a player in here, you see nothing in the hand. That's my player prefab I've updated. But we go to his scene and take a look at his player. There he is, and let's just play. Well, you can see that he's got a hoe in his hand, right? So this is a modified instance of the player, including all those modifications that Rick made to various things to do with the capsule collider, etc., to make it, and the ground check distance and all sorts of other stuff that made him or seem to sort out some of his movement bugs. Now, we haven't fully got to the bottom of that bug, but the point is that the player prefab is in a bad state right now. Rick has a modified player instance in his scene, which is not the same as the prefab. So just be aware of that. We'll sort that out in the next video where we start to think about using scriptable objects on the player to make sure we reduce the amount of contingency, or not contingency, but what's the word I'm looking for? When you have broadband and lots of people can share the same bandwidth, then you have contention. That's what we're looking for. Reduce the contention on the player prefab by shifting some of this data that he's changing into a scriptable object. All right, so that's an aside, and I'm aware that my player prefab is in a bad state. But for this video, I want to focus on going back to my showcase scene, which is also a mess, by the way, because we've got the combat sandbox level that contains the terrain of the showcase scene. All sorts of stuff needs sorting out, and we'll sort it out real quick. But let's focus on just finishing what we've got right here, which is that my player needs to be spawning with the correct weapons in hand. So how do we do that? Well, first thing we need to do is have the idea of some sort of grip. Or this is how I'm going to choose to do it. I'm going to say a given weapon like a hoe has a particular grip. So what I'm going to make myself is an empty, and I'm just going to call it hoe grip for now. All right, and I'm going to make that into a prefab. So it's a grip prefab. It's just a transform. That's all it is. Then how am I going to use that? Well, what we need to do is we need to say that the hoe has the concept of a grip. So we're going to go ahead and edit the hoe script and now give this the concept of a grip. Now I'm going to make this public in this case. I'm going to make it very easy to set. Public transform, grip transform. And I'm going to allow other classes to set this grip if necessary from the outside. All right, it's okay to use public if you think about it carefully and decide when you want to do it and when you don't want to do it. I could serialize it and then provide setter methods, etc., but I think this is fine. It's okay for things to set the grip on the weapon. So now that the weapon scriptable object has a field for the grip, in a moment, if this compiles, it should come up and say, hey, what's my grip transform? Well, here it is. It's some hoe grip. All right, now the player needs to make use of this next. So in the player class, we need to be talking about finding this grip and then using it when we instantiate. So we instantiate the weapon, we put the weapon in the hand, but we have a to-do. Move to correct place and child to hand. So what we're saying is that the weapon's transform position, or local position actually, not that, the weapon's local position, i.e. relative to its parent transform, which is the player's hand, equals the current weapon, or is it weapon in use, dot. Now, because we made it public, we can get straight to the grip transform, and we can say, what's the grip transform local position? So this is just an adjuster. Now, we need to do the same thing with the rotation. We want to be able to set the weapon's position in his hand, where he holds it, and the local rotation. Cool. So hopefully that's clear what's going on there. We go get the prefab, instantiate it, set its position and rotation, and that all rolls up quite nicely into put weapon in hand, which happens on player start. So how do we now set this particular grip transform? Well, what you need to do is the following. If you play your game, what you want to do is you want to notice that this hoe is just standing, that's been instantiated, is standing in the world there. So firstly, it's not being childed to the hand. So when we instantiate the weapon, it needs to go in the player's hand. So what we need to do is have the concept of the socket that the weapon goes in. So we can serialize, excuse that very loud S sound there, serialize up a game object, which is the weapon socket. Okay, or the weapon holding point. Now I've typed serialized field wrong, but that's okay. I can fix that. So now the player has the concept of a weapon socket. So if we go look at the player himself, this player instance, I'm not working on the prefab at this very moment, it's going to say, what is my weapon socket? Where do I hold things? Well, this is where we get to choose that we're going to hold it down the left shoulder, left upper arm, left lower arm, in the left hand. All right, so you get your left hand available, and you tell your player it's the left hand that we're going to be using. Very meaningful. The weapon in use is the hoe, it's in the left hand. All right, now, we could apply this back to the prefab with thought, remembering that Rick's instance in his world is very different to this now. We'll have to merge those together later. So now we have the idea of which is the socket. So when we instantiate, we don't just instantiate it anywhere, we child it to the weapon socket. Let's have a look at that effect. You have to child to a transform, not just a game object. So the weapon socket is a game object. We child it to the transform of that weapon socket. Let's see what happens. We'll have a weird hoe floating in the middle of somewhere, but at least moving with the player. And it's actually flashing on the right-hand side of my screen. Depending on the frame rate of this video, you may or may not see it. So it is attached to the player, but it is not in exactly the right place. So what do we do? Well, this is how you get it back to where you want it. You play the game. You go find that weapon. If you look in the left hand, we have a dirty old hoe. Now, we could reset the transform of the dirty old hoe. There it is, straight away in the player's hand. Now, while still playing the game, you can ask yourself the question, where do I want this? In fact, let's move this player so we can see what we're doing. Doesn't really matter where he is. Now, click on his hoe. Easy way to select it, or at least a part of the hoe. There you go. Now, let's get into rotation. So firstly, he wants to be holding it more like that. Maybe, I think, sharp edge down. So that's the kind of rotation, maybe a bit more forward with the blue axis. And the good thing is here that once you've got the rotation about right, you can preview it just by moving him around in game view. Yeah, it's not far off, but he's holding it in a very improbable way right on the end. So the other thing we can adjust with this is the translation along its local axis. Now be careful, grab the right bit, not just the handle. And then let's look at that. And if we decide that we're happy with that, looks quite natural to me, then we can say, well, the dirty old hose transform in terms of the position, he's holding it 19 centimeters offset one way and 69 centimeters along this axis from the end to where his hand is, and then he's got a certain amount of rotation. If we copy that transform, copy the component values and paste those onto the hoe grip, now the hoe grip will remember those details. So when we spawn again, by leaving and re-entering play mode, it goes in the right place. That's pretty cool. So hopefully that all makes sense, and we're about to find out whether that made sense. So adjust the grip for a second weapon. Pick yourself a second weapon. Ensure that it spawns with the desired grip. So go ahead, pause the video, and let's get that bit done now. All right, welcome back. So second weapon in question is going to be the rod. So I'm going to tell the player that the player instance that his current weapon in use is the rod. An easier way to do that is to click the little dot by the weapon in use. Because it's typed by weapon, if you go to assets, you get all of the weapons. So that's pretty cool, right? Really easy to switch out the weapon, at least not at playtime. If you're at playtime, then the weapon won't switch yet because the only time that the instantiation happens is on start, all right? But we can change that later. So we play the game with the... actually, hang on 1 second. I need a transform for this rod, don't I? So I can go borrow that from the hoe. I can grab the hoe grip, or I could just make one fresh. I mean, it's pretty simple. Let's just make one fresh, actually, because it's just an empty transform. So we create an empty. We call it rod grip. Don't need it in the scene. That's just so that we've got a grip. We better associate the rod grip with the rod. Now, you could have one-to-many later. You could say that which weapon has multiple grips or lots of other structures here. But let's just stick with this simple structure for now. Then we play the game. Comme ça. Okay. Is he... yeah, he's got a rod off in the middle of nowhere. So again, you select, let's say, the player. Like so. If we look inside the player's hand, he's got a rod of death. Reset the transform of the rod of death. Brings it there. Looks ridiculous, but that's the purpose of being able to adjust this. Now, this means that we don't have to rely too much on the model that we get in the asset pack, because we can adjust this however we want. So how do we want him to hold the rod? Something like that, perhaps. And then you can just transform it a little bit so it's not right there. Looks ridiculous, but ridiculous is what our game's about. So, yeah, that really does look ridiculous. Now, Rick can tweak these things all he likes. I'm just going to get a vaguely sensible initial transform position. That looks all right. Cool. So, what do we do here? We take the rod of death. We grab its component values. We paste them onto the rod grip. And then that's it. We're done because it's saved into the rodgrip.prefab file. So, if we play again with the rod, it's in the right place. And again, if you go to the player and switch out to the hoe, all that easy way, remember, is to just choose the weapon there, switch to the hoe, which is the starting weapon, and look at that. Off we go. That is pretty cool. All right, how are we doing for time? Been going 11 minutes. What I'm going to do in the last few minutes is just to sort out some warnings. I don't really like having warnings in the code here. So dungeon entrance has more materials than subset. What's that about? So if we look at this dungeon entrance here, it's got 4 material slots, whereas it's actually only using 1 material, which is this castle brick walls here, this middle castle brick walls. So let's reduce our material slots on this particular thing down to 1. Choose the middle castle brick walls. Not sure why there are 3, Mikey, if you're listening. I'm not sure why there are 3 castle brick wall textures. Hopefully we can sort that out at some point. There you go. That is that. Now let's play the game and see if we still get any warnings. No, we're not getting any warnings on the console now, which is pretty cool news. And what I also like to do with these things is just switch to another scene. Now, Rick here is spawning a hoe into his hand, and of course his prefab already has a hoe in the hand. So that's something we're going to sort out in the next lecture when we do some centralization. The final thing I would like to sort out here is the following. Look, this is a mess. We have Showcase, but in it we have a nav mesh, but we don't have the actual terrain data. The terrain data for Showcase is still in this combat sandbox level, because if I select that and say find references, that is the terrain. So we've got some issues. Let's rename our combat sandbox to Showcase. I'm going to assume that this is not the nav mesh and delete it anyway, because I can always rebuild it. I'm going to move the Showcase terrain into the Showcase folder. Like so. I'm going to just check that the nav mesh looks okay. Yep, I think that's fine. This is the nav mesh in that case, otherwise it wouldn't still be here. Now let's check that our structure is right. Combat sandbox, that needs to go. Don't need a combat sandbox. We also don't need a deprecated assets folder. And this is looking a lot better. I don't like the word utility. I'm going to call that core instead, and we'll see why later on when we work on the architecture. And I don't like world objects, and I'm going to call that environment. So Rick and Mike, if you're watching, note that I've renamed world objects to environment. So this really starting to sing a RPG for us now. We have a core, RPG core, the camera, the characters, forget editor, it's a special Unity folder name, environment, levels, standard assets, we'll get rid of eventually, weapons. So it's really starting to look like an RPG at the folder structure. That's good. All right, and then this is looking good as well. We have some shared materials between all of our levels, Rick's Village with all its bump in it, and the Showcase with all of its stuff in it. The only other thing that's a bit weird is we have this Showcase terrain.prefab. Well, that was Rick modifying our default terrain and making it into something called Showcase terrain prefab. Well, we have a terrain instance here, right? This is the showcase terrain. So this guy, the original intention of this was it was a terrain that we were going to use to just be in the right place. So let's take this up a level to levels. Call it default terrain or starting terrain. Label it with scene setup like that, which what I just did not do that. That was the filter. The labels are down in the asset labels. Okay, it is set up as scene setup. And let's just make ourselves a new scene temporarily and see what this is like. Okay, well, it's got the grid, but I'm not too worried. This can be our new default starting terrain. It is hopefully in the right place. Let's just check. Yeah, it's at y equals minus 100. We can see here, and all the ground has been raised up to the level of 100, so that's all good. All right, so in future, when we make a new scene, let's just remember to go to scene setup and dump all of these things in, which now include the starting terrain. They should also be including the camera arm and the event system and the game canvas. All of those things should have the scene setup tag on them, so I'll just do that. Now, when we search for scene setup, yeah, we've got everything we need for a new scene. Should we test that hypothesis? Let's delete everything, pop all this in, and see if we get something reasonable. That's looking okay. Of course, we may also want the player in there as well, so why don't we do that? Tag the player with scene setup, which is the label here. Now, delete everything. And again, you want to try and keep it. Eventually, we might want to make some code to do this, but you want to try and keep it so that if you make a blank scene, you go to scene setup, dump everything in. Remember, one of our mandates was we wanted to be able to play the game and then move around in the world. So the problem here is that this ground does not have a nav mesh yet. So here we're just testing a new scene. Make sure that with a nav mesh that this works. Just check when the nav mesh comes on. There it is. So with the nav mesh, let's see if it works. Yep, he can now move around. He's got UI, etc. Okay, so apart from baking the nav mesh, we are in a situation where we can just stuff a terrain down and get moving. So going to get rid of the test scene. Don't need that anymore. Going to get rid of the test folder that had that test nav mesh in it. And I think we are pretty good and tidy. Leave it on the showcase scene and we're good to go. All right, wicked. Onwards and upwards.